The wind in Sector 8 always smelled like melted plastic and burnt ozone. It was a place the rest of the galaxy had long since forgotten, a decaying scar on the outskirts of the failed neutral zones, left behind after the ceasefire. Cracked ferrocrete roads snaked between collapsed shelters and hollow-eyed faces. Smoke curled from smoldering trash fires, and overhead the sky was a colorless smear of static light. No birds, no sun. Just the high whine of surveillance drones and the soft, constant hum of desperation. The walls surrounding the sector were rusted metal patched with scavenged starship panels, some still faintly bearing the logos of long-dead planetary alliances. A few scrappy solar rigs stuck out at crooked angles, barely holding enough charge to run low-power heaters at night. There were no real homes here, just tarps, barrels, and the hollow shells of what used to be refugee pods. This was where the galaxy dumped those it didn't know what to do with anymore. The wounded, the exiled, the unwanted. And it was here that Derek first saw her. He had only come to deliver water filters, his usual supply route through the outer rim refugee zones. It was contract work, nothing special. But he was the type to keep things running long after everyone else stopped caring. He wasn't military, not anymore. Just an engineer with an old truck, a toolkit, and more ghosts than he cared to count. He hadn't planned to get out of the cab, but then he saw something strange out of the corner of his eye, motionless, half sunken in the sludge near one of the fire pits. At first he thought it was just another collapsed tent or the remains of a scavenged bot. But the shape had limbs, delicate, curled in on themselves. Still. He slowed the truck, squinting through the dust-coated windshield. It was a woman, at least, something shaped like one. He stepped down from the cab, boots squelching in the sludge. Around him, the locals, what few were still conscious in the haze, kept their distance. They glanced at her and looked away quickly, pretending she wasn't there. No one moved to help. No one even whispered. That alone told him something was very wrong. She was lying in the mud as if it had risen up and tried to swallow her whole. Her skin, where it wasn't caked in grime, was a deep, smooth green with a faint shimmer like moss in moonlight. Her face was angular, almost too symmetrical. Her ears were longer than a human's, curved slightly backward. Her hair, so black it gleamed almost blue, hung in ropes, plastered against her face and neck. She looked like she'd been there for days, maybe weeks, too still to be asleep, too broken to run. He crouched near her, careful not to spook her. "Hey," he said softly, his voice almost drowned out by the wind. "Can you hear me?" She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just kept staring, not at him, but somewhere behind him, like she was watching something only she could see. He looked around. The other refugees were doing their best to look busy, but none of them came close. A few muttered words in languages he half recognized. The tone was always the same, disgust or fear. Derek studied her face. Her jaw trembled, barely noticeable. She was still alive. He shrugged off his coat and carefully laid it across her shoulders. Still no response. It wasn't until his fingers brushed her arm, skin cold as stone, that she moved. A tiny twitch, almost nothing, but her breath hitched and her eyes widened for a fraction of a second. That was enough. She was still in there somewhere. Derek slid his arms beneath her, lifting her gently. She didn't resist, didn't cry out. She just went limp against him, her body feather-light. The coat slid off one shoulder, revealing a network of pale scars that looked like they'd been burned into her skin. He carried her past the silent stairs and muttered warnings, back to the truck. No one tried to stop him. No one wanted her. The ride back to his outpost was quiet. She didn't speak, didn't move, just curled against the seat, eyes half shut. Derek kept glancing at her out of the corner of his eye, wondering what the hell he was doing. He wasn't the kind of guy to play hero. Not anymore, but there was something about her, something painfully familiar in the way she folded into herself, like she was trying to take up less space than air, like she expected to be hit, or worse. He remembered someone else who used to flinch like that. His sister, 12 years old when the Acheran assault swept through their colony. She hadn't made it. That memory alone kept his hands steady on the wheel. By the time they reached his outpost, a reinforced maintenance shed with a patchy solar array and a generator that whined like it was dying, she was barely conscious. Derek parked the truck, scooped her up again, and brought her inside. The air in his living space was dry and warmer than outside, though still sparse. Functional. A workbench lined with spare parts, a heating unit buzzing in the corner, a makeshift cot tucked beneath the old comm relay station. The kind of place that looked like it was meant for machines, not people. But at least it was safe. He laid her down on the cot and stepped back. She didn't even seem to notice. There was mud everywhere. On the floor, on her clothes, in her hair. He ran a hand through his own mess of brown curls, sighing. He set up the shower station, rigged from an old ship decontamination unit, and adjusted the water until it ran warm. Then he returned and gently knelt beside her. "I don't know if you understand me," he said, "but you need to get clean. The water's safe. You'll feel better." Still nothing. He hesitated, then helped her up, one hand steady at her back. She moved like a broken puppet, jerky, fragile, barely capable of standing. He guided her to the shower stall, opened the curtain halfway, then turned away to give her privacy. She stepped under the water with all the will of a sleepwalker, and then, a sob, sharp, uncontrolled, raw. Derek froze. He heard the splash of her falling to her knees, the water pounding against her skin, now a deep, luminous green beneath the filth. The sobs kept coming, silent gasps that built into shaking breaths, as though the sensation of warmth was too much to bear. He didn't go in. He didn't speak. He just sat outside the curtain, cross-legged on the floor, and waited. After some time, the sobbing stopped. The water ran clear again. When she emerged, wrapped in a towel, her eyes were red but no longer glassy. Her lips parted once like she might speak, but nothing came out. She walked past him, barefoot, dripping, sat on the cot, curled up, wrapped the towel tighter around herself. Derek brought her a blanket, then turned down the lights. She watched him for the first time, not a full look, just a flicker of her gaze across his face. Her eyes were a strange, iridescent silver, like twin moons caught in the dark. He gave her a nod. "I'm Derek," he said. "You don't have to say anything. You don't have to stay long, just rest." He didn't ask where she came from, didn't ask what they'd done to her, didn't need to. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the walls. A drone passed overhead, scanning, then moved on. Inside, Derek sat at his workbench and pretended to tinker with something. He kept glancing over his shoulder at her. She didn't sleep, not really. But she didn't cry again either. And she didn't stop staring at the water on the floor, as if part of her still couldn't believe it had touched her skin. She stayed like that for hours, silent, wrapped in warmth, and watching shadows. That night, Derek knew 3 things. She wasn't human, she wasn't safe here, and if anyone came looking for her, he'd lie through his teeth. The next morning, Sector 8 was quiet in that uneasy, post-storm kind of way, like even the wind was holding its breath. Derek stepped out into the gray light with a cup of half-warm synth coffee in hand, steam rising into the haze. The dust in the air tasted metallic, and the sky overhead was a murky smear, no real sun in sight. Clouds hung low, bruised with soot. Across the crumbling boundary fence, the refugee zone stirred in sluggish movements, figures huddled around makeshift fires, drones passing overhead like bored vultures, and a distant engine that never quite shut off. He sipped the bitter drink and let the silence settle. Inside, the girl was still asleep, or at least pretending to be. He'd found her curled on the cot when he woke, her towel replaced with one of his old flannel shirts, sleeves rolled up awkwardly over her wrists. She had cleaned herself again at some point during the night, quietly, carefully. There were damp footprints near the water unit, a used towel folded with surprising precision. But she hadn't run. He wasn't sure why that surprised him. He stepped back inside and set the cup on the table, watching her without making it obvious. Her breathing was even, calm, but her body was curled tightly on one side, as if bracing for impact. There were details about her that only hit him now, in the stillness. Her skin, now that most of the grime was gone, was smooth and deep green, like moss polished by rain. It caught the light in a way human skin didn't, with an almost translucent sheen across her collarbones and cheeks. Her hair had dried into long, glossy waves that spilled over her shoulder, still tangled in places, but unmistakably elegant beneath the damage. She looked otherworldly, not monstrous, not alien in the way propaganda often painted outsiders. Just wrong for this place. Too delicate for the filth and noise of Sector 8. Too alive. Derek grabbed a ration bar and unwrapped it, the sound sharp in the quiet. Her eyes opened immediately, silver, reflective, alert. He paused. "Didn't mean to wake you." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. I brought some food, he added, holding the bar out unthreatening. Not fancy, but it's clean. Real calories, she didn't move. Then, after a long pause, she pushed herself up slowly, her shoulders hunched like she expected a blow. Her fingers brushed the edge of the blanket and she hesitated there. Not for the food, for him. Derek set the bar on the table between them and stepped back, gave her space. After a few seconds, she reached for it, fingers trembling but steady enough to unwrap it on her own. She took a small bite, chewed slowly, then looked up again. Still nothing verbal, no sound. But she was watching him now, really watching, like she was trying to work out who he was, what he wanted. If this kindness was just another trap. He didn't blame her for thinking that way. You don't have to talk, he said gently, but I figure I should let you know. You're safe here, as much as anyone is in this dump. She blinked once. He sat on the edge of the workbench and leaned back, arms crossed. Let the quiet fill the room. She needed silence, not questions, not noise. Outside, a patrol drone passed low, scanning the area with a soft mechanical chirp. She flinched, barely, but enough for Derek to notice. So she was tracking sound, or maybe the tone of it. That mattered. He kept his voice soft, measured. You got a name? She didn't answer, but her hand tightened slightly around the ration bar. That's okay, he said. You don't have to give it to me. Another silence. Then she did something strange, something small but meaningful. She reached up and touched the water unit's power switch, just a fingertip, lightly brushing it. Then her hand dropped back into her lap. He raised an eyebrow. The water? No response, but she did it again. Derek realized what she was doing. You like it? He asked. The sound? She didn't nod, didn't smile, but there was a change in her posture, a softening like a wire loosening inside her chest. Something about water calmed her, or maybe it reminded her of something else, somewhere else. He made a mental note to keep it running more often. For the next few hours, they shared the same space without speaking. She stayed near the cot or the heater, always within a few feet of the exit, never turning her back on the door. Derek worked on a broken filtration core at the bench, deliberately keeping his movements slow, predictable, letting her adjust to his rhythm. He didn't ask anything, not about the camp or how long she'd been there, or what those scars meant. He knew better than to touch that wound too soon. But his mind raced. Who was she? Where had she come from? She wasn't just any refugee. They wouldn't be afraid of her like that. Wouldn't shun her. They knew something. Was she dangerous? She didn't look dangerous. Fragile, yes, exhausted, but not a threat. Unless she'd once been something else. And what if someone came looking? Derek glanced out the window toward the distant shapes moving in the haze. He couldn't keep her here forever. Someone would notice. Someone always noticed. Later that evening, as the light dimmed to a dull glow and the heater sputtered, she moved closer to him. Not much, just a few steps. But she did it on her own. She hovered by the corner of the workbench, watching his hands work the tools. Her gaze wasn't frightened now, more curious, focused. He looked up, surprised by how near she'd gotten. You ever seen a pressure valve this old? He asked casually, holding it up. She tilted her head, still no words, but he thought, maybe. A flicker of interest passed through her eyes. He smiled a little. Me neither. Looks like it came off a junk hauler from before the war. Her eyes narrowed slightly at the word war. He didn't push it, just nodded, returning to his work. She stayed there until the heater clicked off for the night. She didn't sleep on the cot this time. She made a spot for herself in the corner, near the water unit, wrapped in a blanket curled tight, but this time facing into the room, not away. He watched her for a long while. Then he shut the lights. And for the first time since she'd arrived, he heard something new. Not sobs, not gasps, just breathing. Even, measured. Like someone who for the first time in a long time felt safe enough to simply exist. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. But one thought lingered. If she had been left out there to die, discarded, feared, unspoken, then someone powerful probably wanted her gone. And if that someone realized she was alive, they wouldn't stop until she wasn't. He'd already made his choice. He just didn't know what it was going to cost him yet. The rain had stopped by the time she emerged from the bathroom. For a few moments, Derek didn't even realize she was standing there. He had been focused on the repair table, trying to coax life back into an ancient drone stabilizer, the kind built back when spaceflight still felt like a dream instead of a burden. The soft click of her bare feet against the floor pulled him from his work. It wasn't loud, barely a sound at all, but in the stillness of that dim little outpost, it landed like thunder. He turned, expecting to see her curled up near the heater again, wrapped in a blanket, limbs tight and wary as always. Instead, she stood just outside the bathroom doorway, and she looked different. No, more than that. She looked alive, clean. For the first time since he'd found her half buried in the mud and wreckage of Sector 8, she no longer looked like a ghost. The transformation was almost surreal. Her skin, now free of dirt and blood, shimmered faintly under the overhead lights. A deep, flawless green with a delicate luminescence, as if light lived beneath its surface. The silver scars scattered along her arms and collarbone, once hidden under grime, caught the glow in fine, ghostly threads, like a map drawn across her body in starlight. Her hair was no longer a tangled, matted mass. It spilled down her back in long, gleaming waves of black, damp at the ends, some strands clinging to her neck and shoulders. She wore one of his long shirts, the hem brushing just above her knees, the sleeves rolled and clumsily buttoned at the cuffs. It hung loose on her frame, but somehow didn't look ill-fitting, just soft, human. But it wasn't the shirt or her skin or the way the light wrapped around her like it had missed her presence. It was her eyes. She was looking at him, directly, steady, not flinching, not retreating into herself like before. And Derek couldn't look away. For a moment, everything else fell away. The low hum of the power unit, the static from the outer comms, the hiss of the water line, all faded into silence. It was just her, standing in the half-light of his bunker, rain-washed and fragile and real. He blinked, suddenly aware he was staring. His voice caught in his throat and he coughed, looking away like he'd touched something too hot. Didn't mean to gawk, just, you look better, much better. He turned back to the workbench, but his hands had gone useless. Tools blurred in his vision. Every nerve in his body was telling him to glance back, to check if she was still there. She hadn't moved. He could feel her gaze like sunlight on the back of his neck. When he finally risked another look, she was closer. Not much, maybe 2 steps, but enough to make his chest tighten. She walked slowly, her feet silent against the floor. She stopped beside the table and let her fingers hover above the drone parts scattered across the surface. She didn't touch anything, just studied the mess of wires, sensors, and cracked alloy plating with quiet curiosity. He tried to focus on what he was doing, replacing a fried capacitor, but her nearness made it impossible to think clearly. Her scent, clean, earthy, with something faintly floral, rose with the heat of the room and wrapped around him like a memory he couldn't place. She pointed at the central panel of the drone, her finger just an inch above the casing. "You've worked with these before?" he asked, keeping his voice low and steady. She didn't answer, but her gaze remained fixed on the drone's internal matrix, her expression concentrated. She raised her hand, mimed a motion, twisting her fingers like she was screwing something in. Derek followed her cue and flipped the housing to reveal the core. "Smart," he muttered, genuinely impressed. "Most people wouldn't know how this opens. Hell, I didn't know until I broke 2 of them." He watched her, studying the way her lips pressed together in quiet focus, how her eyes flicked between components like she was recalling blueprints burned into memory. She didn't just guess, she remembered. "You're an engineer," he said, more to himself than her. Or, "You used to be." Still no words, but the silence between them no longer felt empty. It was starting to feel like something else, something chosen. He stood, brushing his hands off on a rag, and reached into one of the storage drawers for a spare casing. "You want to try?" he asked, holding the part out to her. She hesitated, eyeing the object in his hand as if it might vanish. Then she stepped forward and took it from him. Her fingers brushed his in the process, brief, unintentional, but enough to send a ripple through his chest. Her hands were warm, steady, surprisingly delicate for someone who had endured whatever horrors left her in Sector 8, abandoned and unloved. She turned the piece over in her palm, then knelt beside the workbench, tucking one leg beneath her. Derek sat across from her, careful not to crowd the space. He didn't speak, just watched. And for the next hour, she worked, not with clumsiness or trial and error, but with the precision of someone who had done this before. Maybe not with this exact model, but the familiarity was unmistakable. Her hands moved with confidence, her eyes narrowing as she aligned the power conduits, adjusted the housing, and resoldered one of the circuit leads. Derek offered a tool occasionally, but otherwise stayed quiet. When she finished, she looked up. He flipped the switch. The drone buzzed to life with a flicker of green light across its sensory grid. She didn't smile. Not quite. But her lips parted in the smallest expression of wonder, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she made a sound, a breath. Software, sharply pulled in, like she hadn't meant to, but couldn't help it. And then, another first. She looked at him, eyes shining. It was all there, unspoken. The surprise that she remembered, the amazement that someone trusted her enough to let her try, the fragile, blooming hope that maybe she wasn't gone after all. Derek's chest tightened. "You did that," he said, nodding toward the drone. She didn't nod, didn't confirm, but she didn't deny it either. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You're not who I thought you were." She tilted her head, questioning. "I mean that in a good way," he added. "You're not broken, not useless. I don't know who convinced you of that, but they were wrong." She watched him closely. Then, without warning, she reached out again. Not for the drone this time, but for him. Her fingers brushed his sleeve, light as air. It wasn't a grip. It wasn't for balance. It was contact, deliberate. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just let her hand rest there and let the weight of that moment settle. Something was changing, something deep. Neither of them had the words for it yet, but it was growing in the quiet between them, born of warmth and silence, patience and care. And Derek, staring into those pale silver eyes, knew one thing with terrifying clarity. He couldn't let her go. Not now, not ever. The touch lingered. Not physically. Her fingers had already slipped away from his sleeve, but something about the moment clung to Derek, slow burning and undeniable. It was the first time she'd reached for him not out of fear or confusion or survival, but because she wanted to, because she chose to. And that choice meant everything. The rest of the evening passed in a sort of delicate quiet, not uncomfortable but charged, like the air before a storm. She didn't speak, still hadn't said a single word since arriving, but something fundamental had shifted. Her eyes didn't dart around the room anymore. She didn't flinch when he moved. She even accepted a second bowl of food from his hands without hesitation, sitting a little closer this time, cross-legged on the floor with her back to the wall, her posture no longer defensive but simply present. Derek busied himself with repairs he didn't really need to do, fingers moving more out of habit than focus. His mind stayed on her. Who the hell was she? Not just some random refugee, not with hands that precise, eyes that calculating. She understood machinery like someone who'd trained for it, lived in it, and she wasn't just familiar with tools. She moved around them like they were an extension of herself. He'd seen enough broken veterans, displaced techs, and downed pilots to recognize that muscle memory. But if she'd been someone important once, engineer, scientist, soldier, why had her own people left her in the mud like a discarded object? What had they seen that made them look away? He didn't ask, not yet, but the question had lodged in his ribs like a splinter. Later that night, the power grid hiccuped, a flicker in the lights followed by a sharp click from the backup capacitor. Derek muttered under his breath and crossed the room to check the panel, but before he could reach it, she was already standing beside it, crouched low, fingers brushing along the outer casing. He froze, watched. She tilted her head, listening to something he couldn't hear. Then, without looking at him, she reached under the panel and toggled the manual override. The lights steadied. The system hummed back to life like nothing had happened. He let out a low whistle. "You don't just know machines. You speak them." She turned to look at him, expression unreadable, but her eyes seemed to brighten just slightly. He smiled. "I should start charging you rent." Still no reaction, but she didn't look away, didn't pull back. He wanted to say more, ask more, but something in her face stopped him. A sudden tension, barely visible, had crept into her shoulders. Not fear exactly, not retreat, but memory. Something hard and raw surfacing just beneath her skin. She stepped back from the panel and moved toward the window. The rain had stopped completely now. The air outside was still heavy with mist, but the streets of Sector 8 looked calm for once. No fires, no patrols, no shouting. Just ruin, quietly breathing. She stood with her arms crossed, staring through the reinforced glass at the broken world beyond it. Her profile in the low light was sharp and elegant, like a statue carved from living metal, but there was nothing cold about her. If anything, She looked tired in a way Derek recognized too well. He joined her after a while, standing beside her, careful not to crowd her space. The silence between them stretched long, but not empty. It felt like the kind of silence people shared when there was nothing left to say. Only the weight of things felt, but not spoken. "They did something to you, didn't they?" he asked quietly, not really expecting an answer. She didn't move. "Whoever left you out there, they didn't just abandon you. They made sure no one else would come close." Still, she said nothing, but her hand slowly, carefully, gripped the edge of the windowsill so tightly her knuckles, barely a shade lighter than the rest of her, turned pale. Derek studied her, heart tightening. "You don't have to tell me. Not yet. Not ever if you don't want to." She didn't release the windowsill, but her shoulders eased just slightly. Then, barely audible, she breathed one word. A whisper. A single syllable. "Lyra." He blinked. "What?" She looked at him, eyes glowing faintly silver in the dark. "My name," she said again, just a little stronger this time. "Lyra." It was the first word he'd ever heard her speak, and it hit him harder than any scream or sob could have. "Lyra." He repeated it under his breath like it might break if said too loudly. "Lyra," he said, his voice warm. "That's a good name." She looked down, almost shy, then moved back to the cot and sat on the edge of it. He stayed by the window for a moment, watching her. Everything was changing now. Names had weight. Names meant identity, choice. The "it" meant she wanted to be known, not just survive. That night, while she slept curled against the wall, one hand near the drone she'd helped rebuild, Derek stayed awake, listening to the low hum of the heater and the faint clicks of distant patrols outside the fence. She had spoken. She had trusted him, at least enough to give him her name. But the name wasn't just a sign of healing, it was a warning. If she remembered who she was, then soon, others might remember too. And if they came looking, Derek wasn't sure he'd be able to protect her from what came next. But he knew one thing. He would try. The silence that filled the room wasn't heavy anymore. It was thoughtful, like the pause between two notes of a song you weren't sure had ended. Derek sat at the far side of the room, elbows on his knees, hands steepled as he watched Lyra. Not watched, exactly. Observed, listened, gave her space. But his eyes had barely left her since she'd first spoken her name 2 nights ago. Lyra. He still couldn't get over the way she had said it, quiet, cracked, but purposeful. Like unearthing something long buried and fragile, still covered in ash. The moment hadn't just changed how he saw her. It had changed her presence in the space. She walked differently now. She still moved carefully, but with less hesitation, less fear. And though she still hadn't said anything else since, the look in her eyes had shifted, more focused, more here. He hadn't pushed. He wouldn't. But that didn't mean the questions weren't burning inside him like coals. Tonight something was different. A storm brewed outside, distant thunder rolling low across the broken horizon of Sector 8. The heat inside the outpost was thicker than usual, clinging to skin and breath. The kind of night that made sleep feel impossible. Derek had given up trying. He was used to that. He sat in the half-dark, a small cup of water in one hand, the other resting on the table beside the drone she'd repaired days before. The little machine was inactive now, but he kept it nearby, almost like a placeholder, a silent symbol of what she'd done, what she remembered. Across from him, Lyra stood by the window, watching lightning flicker faintly in the clouds. Her reflection in the glass looked more solid than it had a week ago. Not a ghost anymore, not just a survivor, something more. He set the cup down and spoke softly. "You ever see storms like this where you're from?" A pause. Then her shoulders lifted, a breath passing through her lips. "Yes," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse but clear. He looked up slowly, surprised by how easily the word had come. She turned from the window and walked over to the heater, which clicked quietly as it cycled on and off. She crouched beside it, folding one leg under the other, resting her back against the wall. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then she looked at him directly. The world outside had gone still. Not the usual stillness of a dying sector, but the kind that feels deliberate, like even the wind was holding its breath. Inside the shelter, everything had grown quiet between them again, but not in that sharp, cautious way from before. This silence was softer now, comfortable, almost tender. Lyra sat across from Derek at the small table, fingers gently circling the rim of her water cup. Her shoulders were relaxed, her hair pulled over one shoulder, slightly damp from a fresh rinse. She hadn't flinched in days. Not when he spoke, not when he moved, not even when she accidentally brushed his hand while passing tools during a repair. Something was shifting. It had started with her name. Then came her voice. Her story. And now, there was a different kind of energy in the air. Undeniable and quietly building. It sat between them like a living thing, pulsing with every shared glance, every small, brave step she took toward him. She looked up at him now, and Derek felt the familiar tug in his chest. "You never ask me what I want," she said, voice low, steady. Derek blinked. "I didn't think I should." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "Most people don't wait for permission to take. You just didn't." He set down the tool in his hand. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." A brief silence passed between them. Her eyes, silver and sharp, searched his face like she was measuring something more delicate than metal or code. "You listen," she said softly. "That's rarer than you think." Derek gave a half smile. "I'm a mechanic. Listening is how I keep things from blowing up." That made her smile, faint but real. Her lips curled at the corners, just enough to warm the space around her. She looked back down at her cup. "I used to be touched a lot," she said, not looking up. "In ways that weren't mine to choose. Hands that held me down. Machines that forced their way into my thoughts. Even kindness felt like control back then." Derek swallowed, suddenly unsure of what to do with his hands. "But this?" She glanced at him again. "You. Here. It doesn't feel like control. It feels like quiet." He didn't speak. He couldn't. Words felt too clumsy for what she was saying. So he just nodded, and when he did, her eyes softened. Lyra stood, slow and unhurried, and walked over to the window. The sky outside was tinted in purples and fading gold, the kind of post-storm dusk that looked almost painted. She rested her palm on the window frame, gaze distant. Derek watched her. The way the light played on her green skin, the delicate curve of her back, the relaxed angle of her jaw. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't shrinking away from the world. She was choosing to stand in it. "I was scared of you," she said after a moment. "I know," he answered. "I thought, if you touched me, I'd break. And now?" She turned to face him, her voice just above a whisper. "Now I'm not so sure." She stepped toward him, not fast, but with certainty. Her bare feet made no sound on the metal floor. She stopped just in front of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath. Derek held still, giving her that space to decide. Lyra raised one hand and placed it lightly on his chest. She felt his heart, steady and real beneath her fingertips. Her other hand came up slowly, hovering near his cheek before gently resting there. Her skin was warm, smooth, trembling slightly, but not from fear. Her eyes met his. No shields, no walls. And then quietly she leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't bold. It was slow, deliberate, honest. Her lips were soft, uncertain at first, like she was relearning what it meant to be touched without pain, without expectation. But the longer they stayed there, the more the tension in her body eased. Her fingers curled slightly against his chest. Derek didn't move until she deepened the kiss. Just barely. Just enough to tell him she wasn't afraid anymore. He responded then, hand gently resting at her waist, not gripping, just being there, like a promise. When she pulled back, their foreheads stayed pressed together. Their breaths mingled in the quiet space between them. Her eyes remained closed for a moment, then opened slowly. There was something different in them now. Not just trust. Hope. "Okay?" she asked, voice fragile but grounded. Derek nodded, brushing his thumb along her hip. More than okay. She let out a breath that sounded like a piece of herself returning. That night, they didn't sleep far apart like before. Lyra lay beside him on the cot, not curled tightly or facing the wall, but turned toward him, her hand resting near his, sometimes brushing against it in sleep. She didn't speak again. She didn't have to. Her kiss had said enough. And Derek knew, whatever had happened to her, whatever ghost she carried, she was still here, still healing, still hers. And now a part of her belonged here too. With him. The morning was different. Not just in the light, though that too felt softer, filtered through clouds that seemed to have lost their edge, but in the air of the place. As if the walls of Derek's outpost, battered and half-rusted, could sense that something had shifted within them. The silence wasn't watchful anymore. It was calm, settled. Lyra stood in front of the mirror in the washroom, fingers combing through her long black hair with a quiet focus that hadn't existed before. Her reflection no longer startled her, no longer looked like someone she didn't recognize. Today, she had bathed on her own, not out of necessity, not just to scrub off the dust of another day in Sector 8, but because she wanted to, because her body no longer felt like something borrowed or broken, because she had begun, slowly and stubbornly, to believe that it belonged to her again. She wore one of Derek's clean shirts, gray, soft, rolled at the sleeves, and a belt she had tied at the waist to make it fit. It was simple, nothing elegant, but when she looked at herself, there was a kind of quiet dignity in her posture. Not pride, not yet, but claiming. She was here. She was someone again. When she stepped into the main room, Derek was at the counter, pouring water into a metal pot, with the same casual rhythm he used for everything. His hair was a mess, always was in the mornings, and his shirt was halfway untucked, sleeves rolled past his elbows. He glanced up and froze. His breath caught in a way that made her pause mid-step. He trailed off, blinking like he was afraid to ruin the moment. You look like you. Lyra tilted her head. I feel like me. He smiled, wide and unguarded, the kind of smile that made her chest tighten. You should feel that every day, he said. She walked closer, barefoot, the floor cool under her toes. He offered her a cup and she accepted it without hesitation. No shaking hands, no shrinking posture. Their fingers brushed, and this time, it was her who didn't pull away. They sipped in silence, both of them facing the window where the sun was fighting its way through the clouds. Sector 8 still looked like a graveyard of metal and ash, but inside this room, there was warmth, breath, hope. After a while, she turned to him. I want to stay, she said simply. Derek turned, eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in disbelief. Stay here? Lyra nodded. With you? He exhaled slowly. Yeah, of course. Her lips curved. I wasn't asking for permission. That made him laugh, low, surprised, a little shaken. No, I guess you weren't. I just wanted you to know, she said. Because for the first time in a long time, I know what I want. He stepped closer, not rushing, just crossing the distance between them with that same steady patience he'd always shown her. When he was close enough, she reached out, fingers slipping around the back of his neck, drawing him gently forward. The kiss this time wasn't cautious. It wasn't unsure. It was warm, intentional. A kiss born not of pain or desperation, but of choice, of clarity, of something that had grown slowly and truthfully between them over days filled with quiet glances, careful touches, and the slow stitching together of two broken lives. Derek's hand found her waist, resting there with an ease that made her lean into him. She kissed him again, deeper, letting the moment root itself inside her like sunlight soaking into soil that had known only winter. When they finally pulled apart, breath mingling in the space between them, she whispered, This isn't a rescue. No, he said softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. It's a beginning. Lyra smiled, truly smiled, for the first time, and it was radiant. Later that afternoon, Derek handed her a data slate and a salvaged interface band. We can register you, he said. Get your ID rewritten, not just as a refugee. As what then? She asked, brow raised. He shrugged. Engineer, technician, hell, pick something new if you want. Doesn't have to be tied to what they did to you. Lyra took the slate in her hands, fingers ghosting across the blank screen. The future looked unfamiliar, but not threatening. Not anymore. She looked up. What if I just want to be Lyra? He grinned. That works too. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged skyline and the room filled with amber light, she sat at the workbench, tinkering with the old drone she had fixed days ago. Derek leaned nearby, fixing a wiring harness, occasionally sneaking glances at her like he still couldn't believe she was real. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. She laughed once, softly, when the drone twitched to life and scuttled crookedly across the table. It was the sound of something new being born, not survival, not recovery, but life, real life. By the time darkness fell and they lay curled together on the cot, Lyra's hand resting over Derek's heart, she whispered into the space between them, I never thought I'd find peace again. Derek pressed a kiss to her forehead. You didn't find it. You made it. Outside, the sector remained ruined, the city forgotten. But inside that small outpost, among spare parts, soft blankets, and gentle hands, a war-torn woman and a quiet man had built something sacred, not a miracle, just love. Quiet, earned, unshakable love. And this time, no one could take it from them. Days passed. The steady rhythm of life in Sector 8 didn't change much. The sky still hung heavy with gray clouds, and the distant hum of surveillance drones echoed across the decaying streets. But inside the little shelter, inside their shared space, time seemed to slow. The days stretched into weeks, and with each passing one, Lyra and Derek grew closer, more certain of what they had built together. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic moments, just quiet, intimate exchanges. A glance, a shared cup of water, a brush of fingers against skin that no longer felt foreign, no longer burdened with shame or fear. They spent evenings working side by side, Lyra repairing old tech with a precision Derek admired, while he tinkered with the minor repairs around the shelter. They often shared stories of their pasts, small fragments of memories that hadn't been drowned in the wreckage of war. Lyra spoke more now, her voice growing steadier, stronger with each day, and Derek listened, really listened, to everything she said. She told him about Nithara, about the hills she used to walk with her family, the stars she used to study as a child, the bright blue lightning that danced across the sky during storms. Her voice would soften when she spoke of those things, as if trying to hold on to pieces of her past that had almost slipped away. Derek shared stories too. He told her about his sister, about the hope he'd once clung to that maybe, just maybe, she could be found, whole and safe. He never said it aloud, but part of him had always wondered if she had ever truly been lost. And part of him still felt the empty ache of that unanswered question. But they had stopped talking about the past too much. They had stopped wondering why things had happened. Instead, they began to focus on now, on what they could build together, here, in this moment. The mornings were their favorite time. The sun broke through the clouds just enough to bathe the shelter in a soft golden light. Lyra had gotten into the habit of waking up first. She would always find him still asleep, his face relaxed, his breathing steady, and she would watch him for a moment, something soft in her eyes, like she couldn't quite believe that this was real, that she was here with him. She'd make coffee, then slip back to the bed, sliding into the warmth beside him. And every morning when he woke, he'd smile at her, as if it was the first time he'd seen her. The first time he'd seen her. In the evenings, they'd sit by the window, watching the sky change. The storms had become less frequent, but when they came, they watched together. Lyra with her arms wrapped around her knees, Derek with his hand resting casually on the back of her neck. They didn't speak much during those times, but there was a quiet comfort in the shared silence. The world outside was a chaotic mess, but within the small walls of the shelter, there was peace. Some nights, Lyra would make dinner, simple meals, but somehow they tasted like something more when shared between them. She had started to enjoy the act of cooking, of making something real out of the scraps of old rations they managed to scrounge together. Derek would help with the prep, but mostly, he just watched her, admiring the way she moved so fluidly, so effortlessly, like she had come alive in a way she hadn't before. Their life had a quiet rhythm now, a hum of everyday life that had become both comforting and exhilarating. There was no need for words most of the time. Just being together was enough. But there was still that underlying tension, the one that lingered quietly in the background. Lyra knew it too. She could feel it in the way she'd catch Derek staring at her sometimes, as if trying to memorize every detail of her. The way his hand would linger on her arm or her shoulder, like he was afraid to let go. It wasn't out of desperation. It was something else, a quiet, deep connection. But there was always the unspoken question that hung between them. How long would this last? The threat of the outside world was always just beneath the surface, a shadow at the edge of their peace. Sector 8 hadn't changed. It was still a forgotten place, full of refugees, exiles, and those who had nothing left to lose. The authorities could come at any time. The war could rise again. There were whispers of unrest in the distant sectors, rumors of reprisals, of retaliation against those who had fled or betrayed their people. Lyra's past wasn't truly behind her, not yet. Derek felt it too. Every now and then, his gaze would flicker to the door. His fingers would tighten around the edge of a table or a tool he was working with, and she would know that part of him was still waiting for something, waiting for danger, for the past to break through their fragile peace. But they didn't speak of it. Not yet. One evening after they'd finished their dinner and the sun had set, casting the room in a soft amber glow, Lyra stood up suddenly, stretching her arms above her head. There was something different about the way she moved, something deliberate in the way she carried herself. Her eyes met his and she gave him a quiet smile. "I'm going outside for a bit," she said, as if the decision had already been made. Derek raised an eyebrow, concern flickering in his gaze. "It's getting late. Is everything okay?" Lyra nodded, though her expression was unreadable. I need to see something, be somewhere." He stood up slowly, the weight of the moment settling between them. "I'll come with you." She shook her head, her smile softening. "No, I need to do this on my own. Just a moment." She walked to the door without waiting for a response, and Derek let her go. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. Lyra wasn't running from him. She was just taking a step towards something that only she could understand. The door clicked softly behind her, leaving Derek alone in the quiet of the shelter. He stood there for a moment, listening to the silence that stretched between them. Then, with a slow breath, he sat back down at the table and resumed the small repairs he'd been working on. But the quiet wasn't oppressive. Not anymore. It was a comfortable stillness, the kind that wrapped around you like a blanket. And in that silence, he could feel the weight of what they had, something unspoken, but so incredibly solid. She would return. They would continue. In their quiet corner of the world, everything was exactly as it should be, for now.